Arrived on the camp thinking, here am I doing the nice thing toward these poor little disabled children, and it was nothing of the sort. I got that knocked out of me in 5 minutes.
Kay Morgan Gurr was 14 when she started working with disabled children at a Christian camp. When the camp was over, it was then time to help the children find a church near their home. What Kay saw really bothered her.
At 14, I could see children becoming Christians and us not being able to get them into churches. And where we did, they were patronised. We were questioned on whether they were allowed to take communion. And I could just see the church needed a big education when it came to disability.
Kay would come to realize that she was perfectly positioned to help educate the church, especially after she was diagnosed with a disability herself. Today, we're taking you across the pond to England to hear Kay's story. I'm Jim Kirkland.
And I'm Michael Sherbet. You're listening to the 4th episode in our 5-part series, More Than Our Abilities. This series is part of GPS, God, People, Stories, an outreach of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association.
I find that many people don't know the answer to the question, where did I come from? Where am I going? We're searching for something that will give us meaning to our lives.
That was Billy Graham, and we'll hear more from him later on. First, we want to let you know that there is a safe place to ask spiritual questions whenever you have them, and also explore what the Christian faith can mean in your life. The website is findpeacewithgod.net. You'll also have the opportunity to chat with one of our trained volunteers in real time. Again, that's findpeacewithgod.net. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to GPS on your favorite podcasting app. Just search the full name, GPS, God, People, Stories, so you won't miss out on new episodes.
GPS.
God,
People, Stories.
I am disabled, but it wasn't actually diagnosed until I was 19, so I was struggling a lot with the things that come with that disability.
Kay Morgan Gurr described her childhood like this.
Quite difficult, for many reasons.
Home life was a struggle, even long before she was diagnosed with a disability.
The fact I'm adopted, interesting circumstances around that adoption, but adopted into a family where mum had very distinct difficulties with her mental health, and a dad that was in the room but not really present on anything to do with my childhood. So quite a rocky road growing up.
Even though Kay experienced dysfunction within her family as she grew up in England, her parents did manage to take her and her brother to church.
My parents did actually go to church, having said what I said. Became a Christian when I was about 7, but it was because this amazing lady that led our girls' club, a midweek group for girls, and every week she would go through what it means to be a Christian and what you needed to do.
By the way, if you aren't familiar with what it means to become a Christian and how to do that, we have a step-by-step guide on the website we mentioned earlier, findpeacewithgod.net. Jesus is just a prayer away, which is something Kay would find out when she was a little girl.
Well, in Kay's case, it was a prayer and a boring sermon away. She was on vacation, or as they say in England, on holiday. But her parents, they insisted they still go to church.
Me thinking, I'm on holiday, why have I got to go to church? I was not happy. So I got dragged along to church, and it was so boring. So I just sat there thinking about what Mrs. Roberts, my teacher, had said to me about becoming a Christian, and thinking, actually, I want that. And actually giving my life to Jesus at that point. And, well, I say it's a good example of a boring sermon being absolutely brilliant because I became a Christian at that point.
A few years later, as a teenager, Kay had some early experiences with people who have special needs, a term we use often here in the States.
Which is a good time to point out that Kay and many of our friends in the United Kingdom prefer the term additional needs. Kay also prefers to say disabled people, while most of the people we've been hearing from in this podcast series say people with disabilities.
There are good reasons behind each of those preferences, and we encourage you to read up on them. But since this is Kay's story we're telling, we will use her preferred terminology. She was 14 when she first helped out at a Christian camp for disabled children.
Arrived on the camp thinking, here am I doing the nice thing toward these poor little disabled children, and it was nothing of the sort. I got that knocked out of me in 5 minutes.
Kay worked one-on-one with a young woman her age named JT. As Kay got to know JT and get a glimpse into her life and the experiences of many of the other children, she discovered a lot of churches had no idea how to include disabled people in a meaningful and dignified way.
At 14, I could see children becoming Christians and us not being able to get them into churches. And where we did, they were patronised. We were questioned on whether they were allowed to take communion. And I could just see the church needed a big education when it came to disability.
God had planted a seed. That seed grew as Kay returned to the camp year after year.
Then, when she was 19, Kay was diagnosed with her own disability.
It's a nice long name, myofascial pain syndrome. It's so complicated. I don't want to bore listeners with the actual details of it, but it will affect all of my joints, anywhere that there's a muscle that attaches to something else. So it can affect anything from my toes to my eyes.
Later on came another diagnosis, fibromyalgia.
Fibromyalgia added on top of that means that the bits of the muscles that shouldn't hurt do, because fibromyalgia attacks the other parts of the muscles and lots of other things. Gives me double vision, all sorts of lovely things, and constant pain.
Kay can walk, but not very far. She uses a wheelchair to get around. In addition to the pain she endures, the vision impairment she mentioned makes reading and writing difficult.
On that last point, let's just think about the typical Sunday worship service for a moment. There is usually a lot of standing, maybe some kneeling, and often a lot of reading, in some cases reading from hymnals or looking at screens from a far distance or reading bulletins with tiny print.
And those are just a few of the issues that Kay and other disabled churchgoers might encounter that prevent them from being fully engaged in a worship service.
Church leaders often say to me, what do we have to do? There's a ramp. We've got an accessible toilet. What else do we have to do? I'll say, that's great. I can get up the ramp, but I can't get any further into the church because of everything that's in the way. You know, it's not just the ramp. It's what awaits you at the top of the ramp. You know, it's actually looking at your church from different perspectives. So I often talk about, you know, if you have that big screen with words up on the screen for worship and that sort of thing, you know, is it readable?
In the first episode of this series, we heard some accounts from families who walked out of church heartbroken after being excluded in all kinds of different ways.
One church said their brand new building would be a blessing to everyone, but a family that was part of that church showed up to find that a long set of concrete stairs now stood between their young son, who was in a wheelchair, and the children's ministry.
Another family was sent out of the sanctuary and into a small, dark room reserved for disabled people of all ages. They were isolated from the rest of the congregation, making them feel like a blemish that the church was trying to hide.
And yet another family was told their daughter couldn't attend vacation Bible school because she had Down syndrome. The family couldn't help but think of what Jesus had said, "Let the little children come to me." This church was saying otherwise.
Kay has experienced situations just like those, and many more.
So I had a little bit of a rant at God about this. You know, this is just me sort of saying, God, this isn't fair.
Years ago, as Kay poured out her frustrations in prayer, she sensed God showing her that she could play a role in welcoming people with additional needs into the family of God.
So from that point, I decided I wanted to be a nurse that specialised in kids with additional needs and disabilities. So became a nurse.
Kay attended a nursing college and specialized in pediatrics. She got a job working in a hospital with children, which was a struggle for her physically as her own disabilities became tougher to manage.
And then came the call when I was at this event that said, we need children's evangelists with experience in additional needs.